Wild actually have worked very hard on strengthening our supply chain. So I would actually like to make sure that we include workers in this, and I want to yield at this time to our colleague on the committee, Representative Blunt Rochester, right now.
Thank you, Ranking Member Schakowsky. We on Energy and Commerce have sounded the alarm on supply chain challenges that threaten our health, from drug shortages, our economy from rising prices, and our national security even before the COVID-19 pandemic. But we know that the pandemic exacerbated these challenges. As a Congress, we took steps, and I was proud to work as part of the CHIPS and Science Act Conference Committee to help bring semiconductor manufacturing back home. But we all know that we didn't go far enough. That's why in February of this year, I asked my colleagues to work with me to develop a comprehensive, credible, and resource supply chains package to compete globally and create good-paying American jobs. The Republican supply chains discussion draft we are considering today is a good start, but I believe that Mr. Bouchon and I can make it stronger. When I worked on the Supply Chains Act with Representatives Dingell, Kelly, and Wild, we solicited the input of over 160 businesses, trade associations, and other organizations to craft that policy. In crafting our bill, Mr. Bouchon and I will continue to work with stakeholders so that we can provide that feedback. We agreed that our compromise will ensure that the federal government adopts the same spirit of collaboration, directing them to consult with all stakeholders, including labor and representatives from America's workforce. While we're still working out the details of our agreement, Mr. Bouchon and I agreed that supply chain legislation must underscore the need for focused leadership dedicated to this issue. That means developing a national strategy with specific and measurable goals. And that includes enhancing the federal government's support to the private sector. If we are able to be competitive with China, it means we must make sure this simple premise: if these things can be made in America, we should make it in America. And we cannot and will not lose this competition. And I am hopeful that we will craft legislation that meets this moment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Does the gentlelady yield back? Yes, okay, thank you. All right, I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Mrs. Rogers, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis, and our witnesses for being here today. America's economic leadership to beat China depends on our ability to innovate and maintain strong, reliable supply chains. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed how fragile our supply chains are. Hospitals were short on ventilators and personal protective equipment. People were unable to find basic necessities like food, medicine, baby formula, and hand sanitizer. And manufacturers experienced shortages of critical semiconductor chips, which help power our cars and our home appliances. We learned how easy it is to become over-reliant on our adversaries like China. And we cannot make that same mistake again when it comes to our supply chains and emerging technologies. Our national and economic security depends on American technology and our leadership. At last week's Senate Summit on Artificial Intelligence made clear AI has become a top priority for lawmakers. A recent Commerce Department report, which was required by legislation from this committee, stressed that in order to lead in AI and other technologies, the U.S. needs a national data privacy and security framework. I agree that that is key, and I know many join me in that. But it's not just for AI, it's for American tech leadership more broadly, which is why we've been working on legislation to protect America's information online and prevent China from surveilling and manipulating Americans. In order to make sure these technologies are developed here in the U.S., we also need to embrace innovation and entrepreneurship. That's the American way. We will never outspend China, nor should we even attempt to. Trying to do so wastes taxpayer dollars, it hurts small businesses and startups, and it cedes our leadership and technology and that future to the Chinese Communist Party. to grow our economy, to boost jobs, ensure that the US, not China, is developing these technologies of the future, we need solutions that unleash innovation and spur investment in these key technologies. The bills we're discussing today will achieve this goal. 3 years ago, committee Republicans authored legislative proposals to secure American leadership in emerging technologies critical to our long-term global competitiveness, like artificial intelligence, blockchain, and the Internet of Things. And several of these proposals became the Bipartisan American Compete Act of 2020. If we fail to adequately secure our supply chains, the technologies we rely on every day will be vulnerable to malicious actors and adversaries like China, who want to use these technologies to exploit and surveil Americans and their families. That includes homes, cars, phones. Nearly every moment of every day could be accessible by China and other bad actors. A regime like the CCP, which suppresses free speech, surveils its own citizens to control them, and commits countless human rights violations, should not control the tech future. We saw this when Chinese-based Huawei infiltrated our communications networks. And now we're seeing China testing their self-drive technologies on American roads. We must ensure technologies of tomorrow are developed in an ecosystem that promotes American values and promotes American data and our privacy. I look forward to today's discussion, and I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Dr. Bouchon to discuss his legislation on supply chain mapping and resiliency. I yield.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for yielding. Today is an opportunity to help ensure that our economy and national security apparatus have a stable supply chain that can withstand natural disasters, international conflicts, trade restrictions, and any other number of issues that have led to bottlenecks for American producers. Enacting the draft legislation before us today will ensure that the Department of Commerce has the authority and information it needs to anticipate where and when supply shocks could arise by mapping and monitoring supply chains, and to determine how best to respond when these shocks inevitably occur. I'm also glad that this draft legislation will establish a program to have the Department of Commerce promote the use of blockchain technologies. Blockchains can help secure our supply chains by providing American producers with information on the sourcing of component parts of an end product. This will provide the producer and the Department of Commerce with critical information on supply chain vulnerabilities. I want to continue to work with my colleagues across the aisle, particularly Ms. Blunt-Rochester, and with stakeholders in industry to get this right, to promote a stronger and more resilient American economy. And I yield back to the chairwoman.
I yield back.
Appreciate it. Now I recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis. The COVID-19 public health crisis exposed serious vulnerabilities in our critical manufacturing supply chains, vulnerabilities that harmed our efforts to combat COVID-19 and its economic fallout. Ask any doctor, nurse, or essential worker who needed personal protective equipment during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ask any assembly line worker, manufacturer, or startup who did not have enough semiconductors essential to produce critical products and consumer electronics. Ask any everyday consumer who could not find basic household essentials like toilet paper and cleaning supplies as demand surged and supply chains just ground to a halt. So last Congress, congressional Democrats took bold action to strengthen our manufacturing base, bolster supply chains, create good-paying jobs for American workers, unleash innovation, and lower costs for consumers. The CHIPS and Science Act makes transformative, historic investments to strengthen supply chains and American manufacturing. It included $52.7 billion to spur American semiconductor production in order to end our dangerous dependence on foreign manufacturers of this critical good. And this new law will ensure that more semiconductors are produced here in the United States and not in China. If beating China was not just a slogan for House Republicans, they would have joined us in taking action and voting for this bill. Then there's the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is modernizing our nation's infrastructure by investing hundreds of billions of dollars for roads, bridges, railways, high-speed broadband, clean drinking water infrastructure, and electric vehicle chargers. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which is lowering costs for American families, including health care, prescription drugs, and energy costs, while also combating the worsening climate crisis so we can lead the world in the clean energy transition. Now, these laws are strengthening the economy from the bottom up and middle out. The U.S. has added nearly 800,000 manufacturing jobs during President Biden's administration. Total construction spending on manufacturing in the U.S. has skyrocketed, providing good construction jobs today and manufacturing jobs into the future. But we have a lot more work to do. The supply chain crisis may no longer be front-page news, but serious supply chain vulnerabilities persist. The Biden administration's 100-day supply chain review found that manufacturing supply chains instrumental to our national security and economic welfare remain vulnerable to disruption, strain, compromise, and elimination. These vulnerabilities are industry-wide and affect every American. The Department of Defense warns that the decline in domestic manufacturing capability could result in a growing and permanent national security deficit that presents challenges to our military and technological supremacy. Fortunately, Representatives Blunt, Rochester, Dingell, Kelly, and Wild have introduced the Supply Chains Act, legislation that builds on their bipartisan supply chain work from last Congress. As Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester has already explained, this vital legislation improves supply chain resilience and strengthens our nation's economic vitality and national security. Over 160 stakeholders, manufacturers, innovators, workers, consumer groups, local governments endorsed their supply chain legislation. That's broad support, and that's why I'm disappointed that our Republican colleagues refused to include the Supply Chains Act on this legislative hearing. Again, if beating China was not just a slogan for House Republicans, they would have included this important supply chain legislation on today's hearing. It's important that we have this discussion, but unfortunately, Representative Bouchon's discussion draft is not nearly as comprehensive as the Supply Chains Act and would therefore leave our nation vulnerable to further supply chain disruptions by our adversaries like China. We must heed the lessons learned from the supply chain crisis and ensure that the federal government is equipped with the tools and authorities needed to address supply chain vulnerabilities before they become a full-blown crisis. And that's what the Supply Chains Act does. So I'm hopeful that this hearing will renew productive bipartisan negotiations. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, yields back. Our first witness is Justin Slaughter, Policy Director at Paradigm. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony. Thank you.
Subcommittee Chair Bilirakis, Subcommittee Ranking Member Schakowsky, Chair McMorris-Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone, thank you for inviting me to testify this morning on such an important topic. My name is Justin Slaughter, and I am Policy Director at Paradigm, a research-driven technology investment firm that focuses on crypto and related frontier technologies. Previously, I served in the SEC at the start of the Biden administration as Director of the Office of Legislative Affairs and Senior Advisor to the Acting Chair Allison Herron-Lee, and in the CFTC at the end of the Obama administration as Chief Policy Advisor and Special Counsel to Commissioner Sharon Bowen. I also served as counsel to Senator Ed Markey in both the Senate and here in the House. As we sit here today, crypto is rapidly forming the foundation for the future of commerce and social coordination, and I believe it can help solve many of the challenges discussed during today's hearing and more. I am heartened by the work this committee and others are doing to understand crypto and blockchains. Jurisdictions around the world, allies and geopolitical adversaries, are further along than America in developing deliberate national strategies for harnessing the power of blockchains and crypto. The EU and the UK are well on their way toward establishing regulatory frameworks. Japan and Singapore have in place a clear structure for companies issuing stablecoins, including those denominated in US dollars. And China is marshaling resources across the government to support blockchain technology as a tool for geostrategic competition. It's not too late for us to catch up, but we have to get our act together, and today's hearing is an important step in that direction. At base, blockchains are a special type of shared database that enable the creation of unique, non-duplicable digital items. Blockchains do this by maintaining records of digital information, ownership, and replicating those records across multiple computers called nodes. Fixed rules, known as protocols, define activity, incentives, and updates, with the nodes in the network all having to agree on each addition of information to this shared database. Technological primitives like cryptography and peer-to-peer messaging ensure that the entire system functions according to those protocols. These webs of nodes, protocols, and primitives give rise to systems that can be used for a variety of functions, from the creation of truly digital peer-to-peer money to the formation of new online communities with their own embedded governance mechanisms. Whereas the laws of physics define scarcity in the world of atoms, the world of bits was previously unconstrained, making it nearly impossible to trustlessly enforce digital property rights. While cheap reproduction and distribution is helpful for certain uses, like sharing photographs and written documents, unique items require mechanisms that limit supply. With crypto, it's now possible to own and control scarce digital objects and track their provenance across time and space without the need for a centralized entity. This includes money, art, and digital representations of physical items. You can therefore see how these characteristics could help solve critical problems in the world of supply chain management, where the inability to trace the origins and authenticity of physical items harms consumers, manufacturers, and more. For example, counterfeit goods on Amazon erode the value of American brands and impose higher costs on entrepreneurs and the consumers that buy their products. Similarly, manufacturers of complex products like computer hardware, often assembled from hundreds or thousands of component parts, frequently struggle to manage data records across suppliers in different locations. This is not just a consumer or business issue. A core aspect of securing critical infrastructure from adversarial nation states and other malicious threat actors involves being able to confidently track the movements of component parts. As for our government itself, the U.S. Air Force has a blockchain-based supply chain project called Basecamp, which helps the Air Force ensure timely and secure manufacturing of its essential equipment and provide a reliable supply of needed parts for maintenance, supporting the ongoing operations of our military globally. How can the government therefore continue to play a role in supporting crypto and blockchain technology? The National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence at NIST in the Department of Commerce has already been engaged in research on the use of blockchains for supply chains in manufacturing and research. We welcome these efforts and think NIST's engagement in research needs to be only the tip of the iceberg. More constructive engagement is needed between the private sector and the government on these topics, especially within the Commerce Department, but also more broadly. We also need more expertise within the government on these topics. Like many expertises, crypto is not a topic that is easily learned, but determined study yields vast rewards. Similar to other emerging technologies, crypto and blockchain and the companies building in the space need to be appropriately fostered and given clear rules of the road to operate. The future that crypto can help build is clear. It can help make our supply chains more resilient while also keeping this nascent technology headquartered here in America. Crypto can also offer increased economic opportunities for a variety of industries and communities, as well as increase the transparency of and access to our financial system. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Our next witness is Scott Paul, President of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Schakowsky, and members of the subcommittee. We appreciate the opportunity to testify today. Supply chains are taken for granted when they work perfectly. However, when they break down, supply chains can cause widespread damage to our economy, jobs, and national security. While the acute supply chain crisis that hit hard over the past 3 years is mostly in the rearview mirror, we must understand 3 things as we look ahead. First, there is certain to be another disruption, although we cannot predict how, where, or when it may arrive. Second, many of our supply chains are still incredibly frail and not yet de-risked, decoupled, localized, or sufficiently resilient. Third, while some progress has been made in identifying assets and vulnerabilities through this administration's supply chain review efforts, the federal government still does not currently have the complete set of tools and authorities to identify, prevent, and mitigate supply chain vulnerabilities before they spiral out of control. The United States' continued reliance on China for critical supply chains is a significant danger for our economic and national security. We should no longer question whether China will weaponize its supply chains and our reliance upon them to its advantage. The CCP has already demonstrated an ability and a willingness to do just that. Our vulnerabilities reflect an outdated notion of the benefits of hyperglobalization, which has caused damage to consumers, workers, domestic businesses, and our national security. We must break the vicious cycle of implementing policies that reward imports over domestic production. But the idea is not to build a wall around America or to seek autarky. Rather, we must build more domestic capacity in critical manufacturing sectors and consider localization of supply chains a best practice. Holding this hearing and examining this legislation is by itself an acknowledgement that supply chain resiliency is not a challenge that the private sector alone can fix. There is an appropriate role for government to provide leadership, coordination, and supportive policy framework, and if necessary, grants, loans, and other forms of federal assistance directed to expand domestic production where the vulnerabilities are most critical. This policy idea is as old as our nation. Washington and Hamilton, Lincoln, FDR, Reagan, and others all recognized this and proposed action. It's worth noting that this American idea of policy support for domestic industry is about as far away as one can get from the state control we see in China. The supply chain bill before us today is an important starting point for legislation that can be made more effective by adding common sense improvements to fully address the challenges facing our nation. And on that note, we wish to direct your attention to several important policy provisions found in Representative Blunt Rochester's legislation, the Supply Chains Act, which deserve the attention of the subcommittee. These enhancements would be particularly valuable for small and mid-sized manufacturers, which make up the bulk of the industry. The federal government needs a dedicated office with the necessary clout to direct supply chain efforts and to implement a comprehensive and coordinated supply chain strategy. The federal government should provide coordination for the private sector by creating voluntary standards and best practices that can be used to address supply chain vulnerabilities. And capitalizing a robust supply chain resiliency fund can provide financial assistance where there is a demonstrated need. At a minimum, Congress should commission an independent study to determine whether grant and loan-making authority is warranted. We are deeply concerned that the pending legislation eliminates government consultation activities with America's workers. The Alliance for American Manufacturing is a labor-business partnership, and I can speak with firsthand knowledge that giving both companies and workers a voice greatly enhances the work of building a policy framework to revitalize American manufacturing. Some of the best ideas come straight from the workers on the shop floor. We look forward to working with you to enact policies to make our supply chains more resilient, localized, and de-risked. I'm bullish on the future of American manufacturing, particularly with the proper policy support from Congress. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Our next witness is Dina Ghazarian, founder and chief executive officer of Austere. You're recognized, ma'am, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you to the subcommittee for having me here today. Good morning, my name is Deena Ghazarian, and I am the founder and CEO of Austere, a tech accessories company. I have more than 25 years of experience driving top consumer technology and fashion brands. I've also served as the vice chair of the executive board of the Consumer Technology Association. Let me tell you a little bit about my company. In 2018, I began discussions with retailers and partners about addressing a gap in the home theater marketplace. High-end, beautifully designed HDMI cables, surge protectors, and cleaning products. I focused on finding contract manufacturers that could meet my very stringent design and quality requirements. These manufacturers largely exist in China, given its extensive manufacturing and testing ecosystem that has been developed over many years. In 2019 at CES, at the annual technology show in Las Vegas, I locked up all of my suppliers, capital, and partners and launched our brand, Austere. Little did I know that massive US tariffs on my products were around the corner. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed a 10% tariff on $200 billion in imports from China, encompassing all of my products. My company's scarce capital had to be reallocated quickly to cover these new expenses. The next year, the tariff rate increased to 25%, placing even more pressure on my very young company. To be clear, I'm the one who paid the tariffs. China did not. I had to absorb these costs of the tariffs to avoid pricing my products out of the competitive accessories landscape. To mitigate the supply chain disruption, I sought new suppliers outside of China, but shifting supply chains is not costless and definitely does not happen overnight. With much effort and resources, I found new manufacturers in other countries to meet my design and quality requirements. I was not able to abandon China entirely, but I have shifted 70% of my manufacturing to other countries. Our challenges continued with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The United States Congress and Trump administration helpfully offered the Paycheck Protection Program, and I took advantage of it. For my company, the PPP loans served to offset my tariff payments. It would have been more efficient to repeal the tariffs entirely, which would have lessened the need for the companies to seek government resources like mine to stay alive. As the U.S. economy rebounded from COVID and consumers increased their demand for technology products for their homes, shipping costs jumped to historic levels and delivery times increased due to backlogs at many of the ports. The cost to ship products from Asia to the United States became prohibitively expensive. To get my products delivered to the market on time, I pivoted yet again. I shipped my products to the lower cost port of Savannah. This pivot helped stabilize my cost, keep Austere competitive, and maintain our foothold in the United States market. I did not seek these challenges, but confronted them as a founder and leader. These experiences taught me valuable lessons and equipped me to build efficient and resilient supply chain programs while keeping costs low. Aside from the PPP program, I had no support from the government to help me navigate Austere's challenges. The United States government offered no sympathy to startups who were harmed by the Section 301 tariffs. Our only avenue of relief was the arcane, non-transparent, and highly uncertain product exclusion process run by the USTR. We did apply for exclusions, but never received any feedback from the USTR after it denied our exclusion requests, leaving us feeling like adversaries rather than the United States headquartered company employing Americans and innovating new products here in the United States. Considering these experiences, I offer the following recommendations. First, the United States Department of Commerce, USTR, and other agencies should express empathy for startups that face supply chain challenges and treat us as partners and offer tangible support. Money alone is not always the solution, and often active listening and hands-on guidance make an even stronger impact. Second, Congress should exert its strong jurisdiction over trade policy. The Section 301 tariffs remain a burden on U.S. companies. Congress should urge the administration to end these ineffective and harmful tariffs, which make our supply chain less resilient. Third, Congress can call on the administration to reorient its trade policy to negotiate comprehensive, binding, and enforceable free trade agreements with U.S. allies and other key trading partners. And fourth, ocean shipping reform is also critical. Last year, Congress passed and President Biden signed the Bipartisan Ocean Shipping Reform Act to stop predatory and harmful practices by foreign ocean shippers. Now Congress should pass the Ocean Shipping Reform 2.0 Act and strip the ocean shippers' outdated antitrust exemptions to promote more competition. Finally, Congress should quickly move forward with a new customs modernization bill focusing on facilitating trade and reducing trade costs. I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I eagerly await your questions.
Thank you so very much. Our final witness is Chris Griswold, Policy Director at American Compass. You're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Schakowsky, thank you so much. Members, thank you for this hearing. My name is Chris Griswold. I was previously a senior policy advisor to then Chairman Marco Rubio of the Senate Small Business Committee, and I'm now the policy director at American Compass, a conservative economic policy think tank dedicated to restoring an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. My testimony today concerns the last of those points, industry. The old Washington economic consensus that drove deindustrialization, whereby policymakers looked on and sometimes even applauded as production was offshored, is now under intense and justified scrutiny. Many policymakers, including the members of this subcommittee, have come to understand the importance of a new approach. But it's hard to chart a new course without first getting one's bearings. That's my basic message to the subcommittee. On the way to answering the question, what should we do to strengthen supply chains, policymakers must also grapple with the questions, where are we now, in fact, and how did we get here? The most recent serious federal effort to map the state of American supply chains began in February 2021, and when the administration began its 100-day supply chain review, which was followed by longer cabinet-level supply chain reviews across key sectors. This represented a commendable and useful step, but it also offers two key lessons for doing good supply chain analysis at the federal level. The first lesson is that definitional murkiness can allow politics to hijack the exercise. In the administration's effort, different reports use the term supply chain resiliency differently, invoking the term without consistently defining it. Thus, in some cases, it ends up meaning my preferred good job strategy, or my preferred environmental policy agenda, or my preferred approach to international relations. And we learned that we need a clear and sharp definition to prevent other political priorities from skewing the exercise. Otherwise, the term supply chain resilience risks becoming just another term we use to wage partisan battles over other priorities. The second lesson is that not being honest about how we got here will keep our diagnosis limited and our solutions too narrow. What most differentiates the quality of each of the departmental reports in the administration's exercise last year is the degree to which they honestly confront the economic history behind our current supply chain fragility. The Department of Defense's report, I think, offers the best, most commendable example of how to do this right. The report highlights the decline in private sector capital investment that hollowed out the American defense industrial base and defense supply chains. It points to international competition, for example, China's lower production costs, which made importing materials more profitable than producing them domestically, and which reduced the likelihood of U.S. private capital investment. Any constructive diagnostic effort will require a similarly hard look. Such an analysis will need to be honest about the fact that over the last 40 years, the United States has suffered from declining domestic investment and a pattern of offshoring production. The United States thus came to depend on foreign nations, even adversaries like China, which has repeatedly proven willing to weaponize economic interdependence for our critical goods and inputs. These market trends were permitted and encouraged by policy, especially the liberalization of foreign trade, culminating with China's entry into the WTO, and the liberalization of tax and regulatory policy in the domestic sphere, which, while arguably promoting economic dynamism for a time, ultimately has discouraged long-term domestic investment. Strengthening supply chain resiliency will require us to give the private sector a different and better policy environment that offers enhanced information sharing on threats and best practices, in due course appropriate and adequate support for critical industries, and guardrails against acting contrary to American interests. A standing capacity to monitor and map the state of American supply chains is a good place to start. The bill before the committee rightly offers a sharp definition of supply chain resilience, the ability of the United States to sustain critical industry and emerging technology production, by recognizing that some industries are in fact more critical than others for American prosperity and security. The bill expresses the emerging conservative consensus that policymakers making active judgments about what kind of economic activity promotes the national interest does not violate free market principles. In fact, defending the free market requires policymakers to make such judgments. And finally, by requiring the proposed program to report to Congress an assessment of policies, rules, and regulations that impact the ability for domestic manufacturing to compete, the bill expresses an understanding that a wide range of policy decisions drove this problem and that a wide range of policy changes are needed to get us out. I urge the subcommittee to continue its very important discussions and negotiations, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I thank all the presenters today. I'll begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. We'll start with Mrs. Ghazarian. You have a beautiful American story, by the way. I read your testimony. I understand you're Lebanese.
I am
You're
Lebanese.
Lebanese descent?
Yes.
I'm married to an Armenian.
I am.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And have raised children with special needs.
I do.
Thank
I
you.
have my
What a
youngest has
wonderful
special needs.
role model you are.
Oh, well, thank you.
That's true. I'm sure there's a lot we can learn from you beyond supply chain, of course. But we'll stick to the subject matter today. Can you tell us a bit about what it means to be an entrepreneur in this country and what we can learn about how business can benefit from a government as a resource of information? And I know maybe you can expand upon that, as opposed to picking winners and losers in the economy.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I'm lucky. I come from a family of entrepreneurs, and just about everywhere I've worked, there has been some sort of spirit of entrepreneurship that I've been able to learn from. So when I took my first step to actually open up my own business and create something, the excitement that was there really kind of drove me to make something and make something important that I could show my family and show really our industry what could be done with a lot of focus and effort. A lot of my partnerships and networking is what really allowed me to learn from what to do and where to go. So the private sector and that participation definitely drove us into how we set up our business model. 25 years of experience in the consumer technology space allowed us to be able to learn and utilize those relationships, a good portion of them, especially when it came to manufacturing, being developed in the ecosystem of China. That ecosystem that was in existence, I'd been working with them for years, so when it came time to start our new business and to use quality manufacturing of people who would meet standards that would meet my level of product was absolutely who we wanted to partner with to build the business. I would say what was interesting about being a first-time entrepreneur is starting at what was, I think, a very easy time to get into the business because of the network that existed and the ecosystem that existed. And then in the first 3 years of being in a business, having all of that turned upside down on its head to learn from, there was a lot of places we tried to go to be able to be as nimble and fast as we could to stay alive. I would say a lot of our effort within the supply chain on the private sector side through our third-party logistics provider that gave us information such as you can open up duty-free facilities to be able to hold on paying tariffs right away so you can extend your cash flow. Leveraging, because the majority of my business is on the East Coast, leveraging East Coast facility, the East Coast Port of Savannah to be able to bring goods in and have a quick turnaround time versus working through the behemoth at the West Coast in my neck of the woods in Los Angeles. That information and those efforts is what kept us alive and nimble during probably one of the most trying times ever to be an entrepreneur.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
welcome.
You know, I'd like to talk to you personally, but I want to get to these questions. But very informative. Mr. Slaughter, I know you work for a former alumni of this committee and Senator Markey. You're an expert in blockchain technology, I understand, including cryptocurrency. I hope you agree that the currency discussion is just one aspect of this generation technology. Can you translate for us how blockchain and distributed ledger technologies can be applied to our topics today, please?
Absolutely, and I'll absolutely try to do that. This is a very opaque topic, I know. The way to think about distributed ledger technologies is that they are fundamentally information networks that allow for many different people collectively to access information in a decentralized fashion, but in a trusted fashion. The great example I give is many of the members in this committee, I'm sure, are familiar with Dear Colleague letters. Part of the problem with Dear Colleague letters, as you all know, is as you are circulating for signatures, you have to have your own office control access to the letter itself. Otherwise, edits get made without your knowledge, parts are deleted, it's chaos. We have found that traditionally in centralized settings, you can have things be either decentralized, where many people have access, you can have things easily changed quickly, or you can have things that have trusted, but you can't have all three. Blockchains allow for all three. You can have many different people accessing a network, you can have a consensus mechanism confirming authenticity and veracity, and you have changes done frequently and quickly. That is the basic theory behind distributed ledger technology and blockchains, of which crypto is also a part.
More time. Yeah, I'm going to have to, my time has expired. I'll submit the questions for the record, but I'll recognize now the ranking member of the committee, Ms. Schakowsky, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. I have a series of questions for Mr. Paul, and they deal really with the issues of workforce. And I wanted to talk to you on, don't you think that considering the workforce is very important in supply chain resiliency?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Schakowsky. I think considering the interests and the needs of the workforce and hearing their voices is essential. Any small and mid-sized manufacturer will tell you that their most valuable asset is their workforce, and the knowledge that that has and the intangible benefits of that are extraordinary. Second, We know from our supply chain disruption experiences that considering the voices of workers is critically important during COVID, when it spread through meatpacking facilities, which was not a workforce-driven, but a company-driven exercise. It caused a lot of damage to supply chains and to health. And so considering the voices of those workers is going to make it more successful that way.
And should the Department of Commerce consult with organized labor, with workers, as we go forward to map and monitor the supply chain?
Yeah, I will just say in my experience that having the voice of unions is essential. I mean, may have political disagreements with unions, but having the voice is essential. We operate as a labor business partnership. We have big steel companies, big other manufacturing companies, and the United Steelworkers sitting at the same table solving problems. And we're able to do that far more effectively than when you're leaving one of the key stakeholders out.
I mean, I think if we talk about inclusion of all these stakeholders, that we need to talk about labor as well. I wanted to ask you, has the gig economy always been have a positive effect on workers?
I will say it's a very good question. It's still emerging economy. I'm happy to say that in manufacturing, where most workers are permanent employees and rather than contractors, that it is not a big of an issue. But I will also say that in my experience, we know of gig work that pays sub minimum wage if you cost it out per hours worked, and I think that needs to be a big consideration. It can have some benefits like flexibility and entrepreneurship, but it can also have some serious concerns with respect to wages, with respect to benefits, and it can put downward pressure then on the incomes that you might find in certain communities. And I think that aspect of it needs to be studied very, very carefully.
I appreciate that so much. Should the effect on these gig workers be considered when we talk about any federal study?
Yes, again, I think that's important. One of the other aspects of this, Ms. Schakowsky, is within the gig economy, those workers aren't particularly have a unified voice. And so I think understanding and having that perspective is going to be vital, both in terms of are they being properly classified, are they earning what is the equivalent of a minimum wage, a living wage, or even a thriving wage? What is the relative level of security when it comes to health care or housing or child care compared to workers in other sectors? I think having that understanding is going to be essential to having a full picture of the gig economy.
Again, asking about the gig economy, has there been job displacement because of the experience of gig workers?
There undoubtedly has. You look at modes of transportation and mobility and how that has changed, and that's certainly disrupted that industry. You've seen it in hospitality as well. And so I think understanding the macro impacts of that is going to be important, not only looking at some of the advantages of gig work when people want flexible schedules or what have you, but I think understanding the impact that it's having on specific sectors is going to be vital for policymakers to understand, to make policy choices.
Well, I really appreciate this testimony. We want to make sure that all of the players are included in the analysis of supply chain issues. Thank you.
General Lady yields back, and I'll now recognize the chairperson of the full committee, Mrs. Rogers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Griswold, thank you for your testimony. I'm summarizing a bit here from your written statement, but you essentially said, just like infrastructure, supply chain resiliency has become a buzzword, and that it risks losing its meaning to justify other policy goals. And I think it perfectly explains how a sensible consensus proposal last Congress turned into a multi-billion-dollar handout. As you referenced, the all or nothing approach. Can you explain why it's dangerous to massively spend on varied objectives without first even examining the problems that we're trying to fix?
Thank you very much for the question. I think in my mind, it's a sequencing question. That yes, of course, landscape awareness must come first, both chronologically and logically. You have to know the problem that you're dealing with before you can adequately address it with other policy measures. So I would absolutely agree, I think, with what I take to be the spirit of your question, which is that clear and accurate mapping and monitoring is of course, the right place to start. My organization has endorsed ideas for appropriate ways to support critical industry. A national development bank, for example, might be a good idea down the road. We know that when it comes time, for example, for American entrepreneurs and innovators to commercialize their products at scale, they often have to leave the United States due to financing concerns and other economic pressures. So as a general matter, yes, in my view, there is a place for adequate and appropriate support, but that needs to follow awareness of the problems so that support can be wisely directed, in my view.
Thank you. Mrs. Ghazarian, I thank you for being here, sharing your insights and your impressive life story. Your candor on your work with supply chains in China is very helpful to this committee. And while we have many concerns about how China can manipulate our children through apps like TikTok, or how the CCP is moving full steam ahead to beat America in the deployment of emerging technologies, we know that there's numerous sectors that remain linked to this region. Understanding a business rationale for sourcing from China can be important in America's fostering greater chances to onshore or friendshore our supply chains and manufacturing. Would you walk the committee through your thought process on this and how we can foster more opportunities for businesses, and what are the obstacles you face to do more business here in the U.S.?
You got a great question. I'm an American company, and as an American company, if I could bring my business back here within reason, that would actually allow me to make my quality products at the safety levels that I need to provide for the consumers, I would absolutely do it. I would say it's been a very interesting learning experience over the last 3 years to understand how to remove yourself from a country that is very established when it comes to manufacturing and to shift. A lot of the development work that we could do immediately was in other Asian countries because the network was set up, honestly, as a sub-network, I think, to China originally. So it allowed us the ability to shift and move to Taiwan for certain products and Vietnam more recently now for others. We have done a lot of homework in regards to Mexico. Mexico would be the ideal place to immediately bring production for me, even more so because of the fact it's quick and it's simple, and from a competitive standpoint, it would allow me to bring goods into the country 1 to 2 weeks after being produced versus 4 to 6 weeks when it comes to shipping in containers and bringing it here. So the problem with Mexico right now is, as much as there's an establishment to be able to build the goods, as long as you can put them together, you still need the parts from all over the world in order to be able to build my type of products. So there's still the effort of trying to work through production and bringing the products into Mexico to be able to do that versus leveraging resources in the country itself. So if there's a way to partner with our trade partnering companies or countries like Mexico to get those resources and help build a quicker supply chain, I guarantee you most small businesses like mine would shift immediately because of the competitive landscape as well as keeping costs down.
Thank you. Would you just speak specifically about the obstacles to actually doing more business here in the U.S.?
Absolutely. So the cost to actually leverage labor resources here in the United States is astronomical. I'll give you a great example. I make a fantastic cleaning product. That cleaning product has a lot of value that allows us to be at a more competitive price point with my competition. If I were to actually figure out, and I tried multiple times to source that product here to have it be a made in the USA product, it would double my costs, which in turn would double my retail and would actually take me out of the market completely for that product. It's my #1 selling SKU, so.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for being here. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Chairperson yields back. Now we'll recognize the ranking member for his questions. Mr. Pallone for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis. National crisis demands strong leadership and leadership capable of meeting the moment, overcoming bureaucratic impediments, and forming and maintaining lasting partnerships. During the pandemic, in the face of one of the nation's worst supply chain crises, there was no dedicated federal entity responsible for leading a government-wide response to supply chain shocks. The Biden administration had to create supply chain leadership on the fly, designating John Porcari to serve as its point person on port disruptions, establishing supply chain task forces, and directing agencies with competing missions and limited resources to identify and address supply chain vulnerabilities. But we have to move away from crisis triage and transition to a more effective crisis prevention and management approach to supply chain vulnerabilities. And that's why I'm a strong supporter of the Supply Chains Act, legislation endorsed by over 160 stakeholders, including manufacturers, innovators, workers, consumer groups, and local governments. This vital legislation recognizes the importance of a dedicated office and strong leadership at the Department of Commerce to spearhead a whole-of-government approach for preparing for and responding to supply chain shocks. So let me go to Mr. Paul. The supply chain discussion draft on today's hearing does not create an office helmed by an assistant secretary. Do you believe that identifying a dedicated office and assistant secretary to lead the Department of Commerce's supply chain work is important?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Pallone. I do think it would be incredibly valuable to have an office and a dedicated assistant secretary. The Commerce Department, as you well know, is large, expansive, has many agencies working on many things. It responds to crises. It was able to do that somewhat, obviously, during the last supply chain crisis. But having a permanent office there both indicates a level of importance that policymakers are attaching to supply chain resiliency because of the economic costs of not doing so, number one. Number two, it also speaks volumes to manufacturers in the United States, and I think this is important. Over the years I've been doing this work, one of the most frequent complaints I've heard from small and mid-sized manufacturers when it comes to interacting with the government, and many have a distrust because of the nature of their enterprises, is that when they want something, they don't know where to go. They don't know where to go. And so having a place to go, both for voluntary standards and to understand what best practices are, I think would be incredibly helpful and would help to bridge beyond this effort from crisis to crisis to make it a permanent fixture. And by the way, it would not be an outlier among our competitors. We would be just getting up to speed with what many of our competitors are doing right now.
And so, Mr. Paul, as you say, many of our economic competitors have agencies and offices dedicated to supporting their manufacturing sector. Do you think we're operating at a competitive disadvantage without a dedicated supply chain office at the Department of Commerce?
I think that we're operating with blinders on. I do. And I also think that we are undercapitalizing our manufacturing because we don't fully understand what some of the opportunities, what some of the vulnerabilities are, and particularly for tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, where they could potentially input into original equipment manufacturers. Germany, Japan, again, there's things that we wouldn't want to replicate in those countries, but I think they've been able to punch above their weight from a manufacturing perspective, in part because they've been able to capitalize small and mid-sized manufacturers, and they've paid attention to that. And that's something that from time to time in our country's past we have done, and that we need to restore that outlook rather than thinking that the invisible hand of the free market is somehow what is causing and all determining of that. We should know that the actions of the Chinese Communist Party and deliberate policy choices matter far much more than any of those theories that have been put forward.
Just quickly, Mr. Griswold, the Supply Chains Act commissions the new office to establish and update a government-wide strategy to counter threats to critical supply chains. Do you think such a strategy would be valuable? 20 seconds.
As a general matter, yes, I think the more the federal government can do to offer a coherent economic diagnosis and a coherent economic plan to remedy that diagnosis, yes. I'll remain tactfully agnostic as to the specific form that should take in the context of this hearing. But as a general matter, yes, of course.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, gentleman yields back. Now I'll recognize Dr. Bouchon for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis, Chairwoman Rogers, for calling today's hearing. I will comment a little bit on that issue with all due respect to the approach from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Expanding an already bloated federal government will not address the supply chain issue, in my view. I suspect we already have dozens, literally dozens of federal agencies that can address this without adding another political appointee at the Department of Commerce. That said, we need to address it. The last few years have shown how supply chain shocks in sectors such as semiconductors and pharmaceuticals are having real impacts on the lives and livelihoods of people that I represent. In order to prepare for future shocks, policymakers and American businesses need to have reliable information on where our supply chain vulnerabilities are today, where they will be in the future, and what meaningful steps we can do to take to address them. I'm proud to lead the draft legislation and work with Ms. Blunt-Rochester that will establish a pair of programs within the Department of Commerce without adding another political appointee. One program to promote resilient supply chains and respond to supply shocks in sectors relying on emerging technologies, and the other to promote the use of blockchain technologies and enhance public awareness of their uses. I'll have to admit I don't understand blockchain. Does anybody? I don't know. That was a joke. Another key component of the bill is the establishment of a coordinated group made of private industry and federal agencies to identify and address supply chain vulnerabilities, gathering voluntary data from the private sector and sharing best practices on avoiding supply chain shocks. So, Mr. Griswold, in your testimony, you mentioned that political priorities can skew policymakers' decisions when it comes to supporting and guiding our economy to avoiding supply chain shocks. Do you think that the coordination group established in the draft legislation would help guide policymakers away from such politically driven decisions, since we're combining the private sector as well as the public sector? Just a general impression.
Yeah, my general impression would be that the wider a net that this effort can cast, the better off it will be. The diversity of perspectives, I think, can only be constructive.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Slaughter, as this committee continues to work towards secure supply chains, I think industry stakeholders need to be confident that the information they submit to the Department of Commerce to monitor supply chains is secure. As a former staff member at agencies that handled extremely sensitive business information, do you believe current data protection protocols in place at the Department of Commerce are sufficient to ensure the protection of this extremely sensitive data?
It's a great question. I would say that in general, you can always have more data protection. The problem of data fundamentally is that it's much easier to attack and hack it under traditional means than it is to defend it. This is a consistent rule. Yeah. I remember once being told if cybersecurity was a risk, it was a soccer game, it'd be 270 to 269. That is part of the appeal of blockchains, is because you have cryptography underlying it, you can have additional protections in place for them.
Yeah, great. Are there again, following up, are there additional data security measures that could be applied to data that industry stakeholders submit to ensure they feel confident that their information will stay secure? And you already implied blockchain is one of the things, right?
That's one, and there's also additional measures. The biggest issue, of course, for the government is always keeping up to speed with today's technology, and it's understandable. Things move in technology at the speed of Moore's Law. Every 18 months you have a significant change in technological power. It's hard for government to keep up. People are busy. That is part of the appeal of having people focused in the government on nascent technology.
Yeah. And again, as a follow-up, and you've talked about this already, I think, but what are some of the specific uses of blockchain and other distributed ledger technologies that could help American producers resist supply chain shocks and become generally more resilient?
It's a great question. A lot of what you can see is already happening is individual companies putting chips, putting information in a handbag, in a bottle of wine or whiskey, that you can then track the authenticity of that via the blockchain. You can also go across the entire supply chain and have, at every step of the way, people have to confirm the step in place, and then that information is locked in on the blockchain, so you can see how everything happened across the spectrum, from the beginning of an item being sourced in Africa and China all the way through to the purchase and even resale that item subsequently. Additional information means additional analytics and additional ways to track the status and anti-fragility of the supply chain.
Is this quickly sort of an AI part of this?
There is a role for AI. There is often a lot of connections between AI, quantum computing, and blockchain. The OSTP and the White House has said all three are significant areas for American research.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Now I'll recognize Ms. Castor, my fellow Floridian, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Chairman Bilirakis. This is an important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. It's an exciting time, too, because it was really just last year that these very important investments came to fruition when the Democrats passed the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and all of these together are really boosting America's competitiveness. It's helping to grow the middle class, to counter China as well. The CHIPS and Science Act alone, I noted, I just got a report, in the 1 year since the CHIPS Act was signed into law, companies have announced over $166 billion in American manufacturing in semiconductors and electronics. And at least 50 community colleges in 19 states have announced new or expanded initiatives to help American workers access good-paying jobs in the industry. In total, since the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, companies have announced over $231 billion in commitments in semiconductor and electronics investments. And when I was home this summer, in St. Petersburg, I met with two companies. One is Plasma Therm. They do semiconductors and advanced wafer processing. J-Bill does advanced manufacturing and supply chains and high tech. And they said they really are now shifting a lot of their domestic manufacturing away from other international players like China. So that was good news. Then on the infrastructure law, the Port Tampa Bay is the largest port in Florida. It's critical to the movement of goods and supplies. And the infrastructure law now, with a $12 million grant, is going to help them build another berth there so that they can load and unload another ship. Absolutely vital to delivering goods for the entire state of Florida. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which is our historic climate law. The New York Times reported just 1 week ago that this climate law and other parts of President Biden's economic agenda, have helped speed the development of automotive supply chains in the American Southwest, buttressing at traditional auto manufacturing centers in the industrial Midwest and Southeast. The law, which passed with only Democratic support, aided factory investment in conservative bastions like Tennessee and swing states of Michigan and Nevada. The law also helped underwrite new investments in electric cars, home solar panels in Florida, Arizona, and California. It said that the numbers show that actual, not announced, business and consumer investment in clean energy technologies hit $213 billion in the second half of 2022 and the first half of 2023. That was up from $155 billion the previous year and $81 billion in the first year of the data under President Trump. So Mr. Paul, are you surprised at the scope and breadth of these investments now and the reshoring of supply chains as a result of investing in America?
It's a good question, and I would say yes and no. I would say I am surprised because there was a lot of skepticism about what could happen. I'm not surprised, though, because it is in response to kind of one of those fundamental laws of economics that actors respond to incentives. And that's exactly what's happening here, is that there is now an incentive to locate this type of production in the United States through a combination of offsetting capital costs, through helping with workforce, to having a procurement market, and to having a balanced trade policy. And you have seen those dramatic shifts in semiconductors and microelectronics. You've seen it in many aspects of clean energy. The way in which this gets to the third and fourth tier suppliers that I think many folks are concerned about with supply chains is to build on that through supply chain legislation to keep the infrastructure investments that you're talking about, because to have those supply chains move without bottlenecks, you need that investment. So I'm glad there was $17 billion for ports and waterways, for instance, some of which is helping Tampa Bay. But we need to keep that momentum going. We have underinvested in our infrastructure, and we have undercapitalized manufacturing for 3 decades. And quite honestly, we're playing catch up now. We're getting in the game with the rest of the world, and we need to keep the momentum.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Okay, thank you. General Lady yields back. Now recognize the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Wahlberg from the great state of Michigan, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel for being here. Being from the auto state and amid the ongoing UAW strike that we all are watching in the news, I'm seriously concerned about how reliant we've become on China for critical components of our fleet. That reliance has gotten worse with the push for EVs, and we have experienced it to the extreme in Michigan. Mr. Griswold, in the Biden administration's supply chain review, some agencies acknowledged the increasing competition with China, especially related to advanced batteries. Yet there seems to be a lack of coordination and action at the agencies to address the problem, with many of their policies pushing us to be more reliant on China, not less, and we've seen that even in Marshall, Michigan, with Ford Motor Company having to contract with a CCP licensed company to provide the resources and the ability for an electric battery. How do we address this growing reliance and improve our battery supply chain? And secondly, are we hindering the potential of a domestic supply chain in favor of a faster EV transition?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, for the question. There's a few things I would say. The first, you noted, I think quite rightly, some lack of coordination between federal agencies, which is one of the reasons why a standing capacity to do this kind of supply chain monitoring and mapping is so vital. And I recognize that there are ongoing discussions about whether that's a program or an office and so on. But having that standing capacity is absolutely essential, so that there's a mechanism for addressing that kind of discoordination. I think the structure of the federal government at the moment is not well suited to addressing the concern you raise. On the question of whether we are privileging a faster EV transition over building our own domestic supply, I think you're absolutely right to point to that trade-off. And it's one of the challenges, I think, that the current administration is facing. We heard just earlier from an earlier question, the IRA referred to as a climate bill rather than a industrial strength bill, for example. And I think that speaks to the attention in the coalition on the other side of the aisle. That is indeed a challenge. With respect to our ongoing and in some cases increasing dependence on China, one thing we haven't talked about yet in this hearing is the ability of the U.S. government to simply say no when it needs to. One of the criticisms I would make of the current administration's executive orders, for example, is that respecting investment in China and semiconductors and in other critical technologies, is that they're too weak. And I think it's important, and I'm glad there is an emerging conservative consensus on this question. It's important to simply say you may not invest in China when it comes to our critical industries and technologies. That's a hard thing to do, but I think it's the right question to ask.
It's also the right position for our industry to take as well,
Yes,
to push back on the government deciding what we're going to do, what we're going to produce as well. I'd love to talk more about it, but I want to switch gears here. When we talk about the gig economy, I prefer to use the term independent workers. Our friends on the other side continue to depreciate independent workers by suggesting they are coercively forced into low-paying jobs. In fact, we know that millions of Americans actively choose and want to work independently because it fits their lives and their priorities. Independent work has exploded in the last decade, from direct sellers to truckers and freelancers. Working independently has now more than ever become a viable and sought-after choice, and I commend Representative Joyce on his legislation to examine this vital part of our economy. Mrs. Ghazarian and Mr. Griswold, digital platforms have and other vehicles for people to engage in independent work kept the economy moving during COVID when many businesses were forced to close. What role do independent workers have in keeping our supply chains resilient, and do we need to do more to identify their impact on our economy?
Thank you for the question. I'd be happy to answer first. I currently, at this time, don't employ any independent workers, but I am fully supportive of understanding how a flexible workforce could benefit the economy, and in turn doing a study to be able to show that. I do believe over time our business will need more and more of a flexible workforce, and those independent workers will be critical with that.
Thank you. Mr. Griswold?
I think I would say that workers in all employment structures are essential to strong and resilient American supply chains, and that regardless of the form that takes, we are right to consider their role in the resilience of our supply chains.
You've hit the main point I wanted to hear you hit. That's for sure. And my time has expired, so I'll respect that and yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Now I'll recognize my friend Mr. Soto from the state of Florida.
Thank you, Chairman, and what a great Floridian you are. Happy to be discussing a critical issue, supply chains, today. We learned during the pandemic, that a plan to import a bunch of goods from 10,000 plus miles away sometimes can hit snafus, right? And so as we're still working in a global economy, it's about making sure we have domestic capacity for some of these essential goods, even while we continue to engage in international trade. The infrastructure law, the CHIPS Act, and IRA were all parts of the president's vision, and so many of us in Congress. We saw factory construction double over the last year, which is exciting. A key part of the supply chain is making more essential products in the United States, those especially that are important for national security and high growth areas. It's all about capacity. We're also seeing nearshoring in Central America and South America as a part of that too. Mr. Paul, where are we at as a snapshot right now between what supply chains are improving and what needs additional help, and what would you recommend for that help?
Mr. Soto, that's an excellent question. And I want to preface the answer to this by saying that I think having a supply chain strategy and additional legislative authority coming from the Congress is going to be essential to widening and deepening the understanding of all of this, because there are limited lines of sight into what's going on right now. And that's not only from a federal government perspective. I think this varies widely by agency. I think DOD has some understanding within its space. I think that other agencies will acknowledge that they do not currently have the best line of sight in there. I think that's also true of some global companies. I think that they have some line of sight into their own supply chains. And I think in other respects, when it gets to the third and fourth tier, they often aren't nearly as aware of what some of those bottlenecks, vulnerabilities, political risk could be to them. And so as we move ahead, it's going to be vital. What we do know is that the incentives that you cited in the bipartisan infrastructure law, in the CHIPS Act, and the clean energy manufacturing provisions of the IRA have indeed brought some new manufacturing construction to the United States, and with it some of the supply chain as well. And I think it's important to get this right. I think one of the things that's going to make that critical is to make sure the administration continues with the requirements that to access the loans, the grants, the procurement, that it has to be made in America to the fullest extent of the law that you all passed. And there were made in America requirements in the bipartisan infrastructure law, in CHIPS and Science, and in the clean energy manufacturing of the IRA. And so I think that'll be helpful. I also think that we still have tremendous vulnerabilities in some of our supply chains. And we know, for instance, if we want to rebuild our electrical grid, there is exactly one supplier of the type of grain-oriented electric steel
You must be talking to my local utilities.
that can provide that in the United States. And so we need to find ways to help build up that capacity.
Sure. I'm worried about the electrical grid and various different types of equipment utilized there that I've heard from both our local investor-owned utilities and local municipal utilities about that. We tried to get that into the CHIPS Act. The House put it in, the Senate took it out, so we have more work to do. Mr. Slaughter, I first was able to pass appropriations language to encourage USDA to use blockchain technology for food traceability. Now it's become a huge part of USDA and FDA. Where do you see the top products and industries of using blockchain for traceability and helping in the supply chain?
So we've seen a number, obviously, and in some ways it depends upon the degree to which the supply chain itself is complicated. There's a lot of players involved. This is where, of course, for a mini-entity blockchain, a permissionless blockchain, the tokens come in, because the token is what allows it to, therefore, the crypto token, confirm veracity. So in general, things that have many different points on the spoke, like pharmaceuticals, like agriculture, these are examples of that. Also, anything very complex. That's why I mentioned, of course, the base camp project the U.S. Air Force is utilizing.
So when people hear token, they think of like a monetary item, but really we're talking about like a tag or a barcode on a box, but it's electronic in nature, just for the edification.
That is the idea, right? There are many different ranges of tokens. Most tokens on a network that is permissionless, it's available to everybody, have some amount of financial element. That's what allows them to therefore work under current permissionless systems. But there's a whole range of options here. This is a technology that applies across the entire economy, not off of any one area.
Perhaps we should call it digital labeling. Maybe everybody will get that a little more. So just a thought, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now I recognize Dr. Dunn from the great state of Florida. In the northern state of Florida. Florida is such a great, beautiful state. I know, it's all over, but that's okay. That's part of my job, and it's all true.
The farther north you go in Florida, the farther south you get.
And I'll recognize the good doctor, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bilirakis. Today, the United States remains in a manufacturing dilemma. Critical industries are tied to non-market Chinese Communist Party. And we may note the irony, I think, that a communist country has absorbed so many businesses around the world and flipped the concept of globalism on its head. You know, it's easy to blame capitalism, profit motives, and consumer welfare for offshoring. But I support bringing jobs back home, and I know you do too. And I cannot say that I am surprised the businesses have sought lower manufacturing costs in China. Ms. Ghazarian, great backstory. I saw that you noted the strength of China's ecosystem as a primary motivator. Surely labor and manufacturing costs relative to other countries was also consideration when you started Austere in China?
1,000%. It was a consideration in the beginning. By shifting our manufacturing to Taiwan and Vietnam, we did take on a little bit higher costs in the actual cost of the product itself. But with the tariff dropping off completely, the difference in balance between the two, it was still more cost effective for us to shift countries, so we did.
Thank you for that. I understand your frustration, by the way, with the USTR's targeted tariffs, and worked with a lot of companies in my district to try to get the waivers on those. I think it's essential for us to get our long-term resilience of U.S. supply chains in the U.S., or at least not dependent on China. Can you elaborate any recommendations that you have for the Department of Commerce that would incentivize onshoring or friendshoring of U.S. offshore investments?
I would say that shifting, again, based on my experience and what I've done so far, there's been a limited amount of time where I've done research to see if we could bring goods back here to the United States. The cost of labor alone just completely takes it out of the realm. So if there's any way to...
Hence the friendshoring references.
Correct. I would also say, too, that a lot of the work that my product needs to be built, There's a lot of hands-on, what I would call technology trade specific learnings that would need to be taught. And if you were to try to go out and find a network of already trained individuals that know how to do that here in the United States, that would not exist. I do believe there is a need to educate and train. I would have to take on that cost, and it would slow me down versus speeding me up if I were to bring that back.
I agree with that. Thank you very much. Mr. Paul, I agree with your assessment. We've become too dependent on China as a single source of goods. They're 29% of global factory output. Calls for us to start bringing these supply chains back to America and its allies. A policy decision that I've been calling for loudly is renewal, a clean renewal of the general system of preferences on tariffs. This is something that has passed the House and the Senate without fail for 35 years. It's a very bipartisan thing. Last time it was voted on in the House, it was like 400 to 2. We are now 3 years late in reauthorizing the GSP, but this provides incentives for many manufacturers to relocate away from China and to countries that have less expensive manufacturing costs. And that's still a win for our national security and our economy. And many companies are bolstered by GSP benefits, which offer tariff-free access to the United States to preferred nations. So I would say that renewal of the GSP is a major step towards moving supply chains out of China. I mentioned earlier China's cheap labor markets attracted mass capital. However, the latest list of the cheapest manufacturing companies in the world, U.S. News and World Report, 12 of the top 20 are already on the list of general GSP nations. In your testimony, you mentioned the federal government needs a dedicated office to direct supply chain efforts towards resiliency. Currently, we have CFIUS, which governs foreign investments into the United States. I think it's worth considering that we have a similar program to monitor outbound investments into China. Can you address that?
Absolutely, and in my testimony to the Select Committee on China, I also called for a thorough review of outbound investment as well. Since you asked about GSP, Mr. Dunn, I would say that I think that the national security goals of the program are essential. I do think the program could use with some reform, particularly the content laws. It allows pass-through of goods. I think you should take a look at that, and also graduating some of the products from it. But I do think that along with TAA and some other programs, is something that's overdue and would give us a leg up.
My time has expired. I thank you for your forbearance, Mr. Chairman. Take care.
Doctor yields back. Now we'll recognize Ms. Trahan for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, Chairman Bilirakis and Ranking Member Schakowsky, thank you for calling this hearing. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted supply chains across the country. It imperiled everyday Americans' access to many things, but including baby formula, flour, cleaning products, and so many essential goods. It's essential that we take the lessons learned from the pandemic and develop a comprehensive national strategy to monitor and to assess the vulnerabilities in our nation's supply chains. And I'm of the opinion that the biggest way that the pandemic disrupted our supply chains was its impact on the workers who actually kept our economy running. Americans who had the flexibility to work remotely did so to slow the spread and protect themselves from COVID and their families, but millions of essential workers put themselves at risk, and they showed up to work every day. And the supply chain crisis impacted their workplaces too. Take the nurses who wore trash bags instead of hospital gowns because of shortages of medical supplies. Mr. Paul, the COVID-19 pandemic upended the lives of every American and every worker, and because of that, caused havoc in our supply chains. What valuable information can labor unions and workers provide to help ensure that we identify and address supply chain vulnerabilities?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that workers and entities that represent workers, like labor unions, are essential to making this construct work. As I indicated in my testimony, the most valuable asset of manufacturers is the workforce. That's where the knowledge lies. That's where the skill set lies. And without them, there would be no production. The lessons we learned from COVID, I think, are also incredibly valuable. When worker voices weren't heard necessarily, we ended up with more problems in some cases, either in terms of health outcomes or in terms of disruptions. And so I think ignoring that is to not get a 360-degree view. And I will also say that in many cases, manufacturers I talk to, ideas in terms of finding new products, new markets, new workarounds, new supplies when there were bottlenecks also came from the shop floor, and that's just information that you can't derive from anywhere else. So any enterprise with respect to supply chains to be successful needs to include a diversity of voices, including that of the workers.
Yeah, that seems to make perfect sense. There's no way to get a full assessment of what's happening with our economy during a crisis without talking to the people on the ground who are facing it every day. And if you look at some of the recent economic shocks in our country, it's a consistent pattern of workers making sacrifices to keep our economy running, just like those nurses wearing those trash bags. We're in the midst of the first UAW strike of all 3 U.S. legacy automakers at the same time. Workers are looking for higher pay, and amid record automaker profits after the industry successfully emerged from the pandemic-induced supply chain crisis. But in 2009, when the auto industry was being hammered by the Great Recession, UAW agreed to $11 billion in labor cuts that helped keep GM afloat. Mr. Paul, when economic and supply chain crises happen, how have industry and labor worked together to adapt and to survive?
Thank you. That's a great question. And certainly the auto rescue from 13 or 14 years ago is a good example of that, about how there was shared sacrifice in exchange for some public benefits to keep the heart of American manufacturing viable. We've seen that also, I will say, in the steel sector, in collaboration between workers and the companies to restructure the industry, to make it competitive, and to advance its goals. And so when we look broadly across future industries in the United States, that includes EVs, that obviously includes semiconductors, ensuring that in exchange for that public benefit, that there is some recognition that the work is valued and the workforce is valued, ought to be part of best practice and policy as well.
Thank you. And I will put my last question in, but maybe a written response. I appreciate the insight. The sudden shortages of essential goods like baby formula, cleaning products, and PPE showed that we need to rapidly respond to supply chain failures and immediately act to remedy them. Mr. Griswold, your organization has called on Congress to establish a national development bank to finance projects vital to our nation's economy and national security. This is similar to a supply chain financing provision in the America Competes Act. Could such financing strengthen supply chains for critical goods? I realize I'm out of time, so I'll have to put that one in the record, but thank you.
Very good. Generally yields back. Now I'll recognize Ms. Lesko from the great state of Arizona for her 5 minutes of questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here to testify today. Ms. Ghazarian, you had talked about how you had your goods manufactured in China, but because of the tariffs, I think I heard you say you've moved to manufacturers in Taiwan and Vietnam. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Okay. I'm trying to get a handle on if those companies are controlled by the Chinese government. I mean, is it a way for China to get around the tariffs? Or the companies to get around the tariffs?
So both of the manufacturing partners that we have shifted to other countries with are still rooted in the leadership of the original manufacturing partners I worked with in China. So their way was to shift into other facilities in other countries to still be able to support us with the skill and quality that we needed for our product, but to do so in other countries, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. Mr. Griswold, what specific dependencies does the U.S. have on Chinese manufacturing and raw materials, and how can we reduce these dependencies?
It's a very big and important question, and I'd love to meet with your office to talk about it at the length it deserves. You mentioned critical materials. I think the critical mineral supply chain, I know, is very much of concern to Congress and to all of you, and you're paying attention to it already, but I think it does merit mention. Even though we have started to extract and mine some critical minerals here again in the United States, still not as much as we could. And even those that we do extract often have to be processed in China anyway. We're sending it there and having it come back. That represents a massive vulnerability. The CCP has proven its willingness in the past to restrict or cut off the flow of critical minerals. They've done that. And are clearly willing to do it again, and that would represent a major national security and economic crisis, because as you know, these minerals are used in both military and civilian applications. So that's just, I think, one instance of the many vulnerabilities we have,
right,
and dependencies we have, but it's an important one.
Yeah, and it's just such a problem. You know, we had the Secretary of Energy in front of our committee, our energy, I think our full committee maybe, and you know, she said that she supports domestic mining, but in Arizona, which I represent parts of Arizona, Phoenix, they pulled back the permitting for a big copper mine, and so all of these things that we need, I think, 4 times as much copper in electric vehicles. And so I don't understand it. I mean, I just don't get it, how we're going to get to the goals that the administration wants without doing mining here. I don't understand it. And so, you know, maybe someday somebody will explain it to me. Mr. Slaughter, what measures are being taken to protect American intellectual property from theft and reverse engineering when working with Chinese partners and suppliers?
Not enough. In general, we've seen, in particular, China taking a lead on a lot of nascent technologies. I was reminded today by someone that the Belt and Road Initiative, when they place, you know, roads from Kathmandu to Khartoum, also they bring with it digital yuan and blockchain information. This is a major concern, that if the Chinese or other hostile actors have the, you know, foundation of the next generation of the internet, our information security as a whole in the U.S. will be hurt.
Yeah, it's, you know, we have a heavy lift here in the United States, and I think we share our goal, Republicans and Democrats, of bringing back manufacturing here, but it's going to be tough because we're so darn reliant on China. And they can hurt us without even firing a shot. And scary stuff. Thank you, and thanks for being here, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I'll recognize the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Harshbarger, for her 5 minutes of questioning. And you notice I didn't mention the football game from last weekend.
Don't start something now, Gus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. We have had many prior witnesses who've testified before how the pharmaceutical supply chains are incredibly complex and difficult to trace. You know, and I've been a pharmacist 36 years, and I'm responsible for knowing where each and every step in the supply chain is due to a pedigree. We have to know that the wholesalers are registered and every step of where that drug comes from or API comes from. So, Mr. Slaughter, I guess my first question is, how could blockchain technology be used to help pharmacists and wholesalers?
So there's a number of companies already working on utilizing blockchain technology and crypto for pharmaceuticals. I think MedChain is one of them, PharmaChain is another. Happy to follow up with your office afterwards.
Yeah.
Because of the many different components of sensitive information and location involved in the creation of vaccines, of pharmaceutical products, it's very important to have total confidence in the purity and veracity of those components throughout the entire chain. That is part of the appeal of how blockchain could help the supply chain there.
Okay. I would like to follow up with you on that later. Ms. Ghazarian, you briefly shared about concerns related to a mandate from Commerce requiring you to share information. And on a similar note, how would you feel if there were voluntary standards in place that didn't protect you from litigation or pose a risk to expose trade secrets?
Unfortunately, if there wasn't any protection, I would not feel comfortable providing that data. If there was some sort of protection and legal protection at that, if I did provide that information, I would be happy to do so. It is in my best interest to strengthen the United States.
Yeah.
We just need to make sure that we're protected.
Absolutely, I agree. Mr. Griswold, since the pandemic, we've talked a lot about government standing up programs to fix supply chains, but the government often causes supply chain problems. If there was a regulation that you would eliminate to help our supply chains be more resilient, what would it be?
We've, I think, already started to touch on that question in this discussion. My organization's published, for example, on NEPA reform. I think, no one here is in favor of making our air or water dirtier, but we can keep our environment clean and be responsible stewards of our natural resources and let ourselves build things at the same time. One of the more encouraging things from my perspective that we've seen in recent months is an emerging bipartisan interest in permitting reform.
Yes.
That strikes me as very encouraging. If we can find a bipartisan and therefore politically durable way of keeping the environment safe while allowing ourselves to build again, I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about reform of that program. I have another question, Mr. Griswold, Mr. Slaughter. How many labor unions exacerbated the supply chain shortfalls in this country, and what's the best way to counter organized labor when they hold supply chains hostage?
I think I would respectfully take a different view of the premise. Organized labor, at least organized labor that represents workers who build things, have a vested interest in increasing domestic production. Of course, they're some of the ones who will get the jobs. So in my view, it may be constructive to view organized labor as a potential asset to be mobilized in this political fight versus an impediment. And I might also just add that in my view, worker discontent, whether that takes the form of a strike in an organized labor context or just the great resignation and people quitting jobs they don't think are good jobs, worker discontent is itself a supply chain risk, and that it's a legitimate one to consider in my view. So I think I would respectfully just take a different view of the premise of your question.
Okay, Mr. Slaughter?
I would also respectfully disagree. We've seen unions interested in crypto and blockchain technology for a variety of uses. I know that there is a notable commentator, the blockchain socialist, who often writes about the way that crypto could be utilized to organize workforces in the future. I regard organized labor as part of the role of the supply chain as well.
Okay, very good. Well, I don't have enough time for the other questions, so Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now we'll recognize Mr. Allen for his questioning. And Mr. Prince, I'm sorry, you were about 5 seconds late, but we'll get to you. Thank you, Mr. Allen. You're recognized, please.
I'll be quick.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair, for convening this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses. Obviously, we really need to get to the. We need to drill down and figure out what is going on with the supply chain. I think we could do that pretty quickly if we could get to the issue with it. Obviously, it has something to do, obviously, with the war on fossil fuel. It has something to do with we lost. Where did 10 million workers go during COVID? We have roughly 10 million jobs open out there today, and we lost those workers. Unless we can, at least I come from the business world, what I'm understanding, the big problems in a business just maintaining the status quo is obviously getting materials first, and workforce is first, and getting the materials and whatnot to produce the product or build the building or whatever is second. And those two are somewhat improved, but we got a long way to go. Mr. Griswold, we can measure supply chains on a spectrum where at one end is efficiency and the other end is resiliency. Because of the effects of COVID, we were shown that just-in-time manufacturing techniques, along with the offshoring of so much of our manufacturing, have led to the supply chains and to become brittle and not resilient. How do we make the determination whether our supply chain should be built to weather a once-in-100-years event like a pandemic, or should we assume that disruptions like this will continue to happen more frequently with increased global fragmentation?
It's a fantastic and important question, and I'm very glad that you pointed out the shifting consensus that market efficiency alone is not a sufficient economic frame of mind to bring to these questions. And that's true in supply chain resiliency as it is in many other respects in our economy. I think we've seen the political discussion about that change in recent years in both parties, quite rightly so. I might answer the question in terms of national sovereignty. If we overly lean in the direction of efficiency and therefore supply chain fragility, we compromise our own ability to make our own decisions about what's in America's best interest. A good example in my mind are the recent sanctions Congress put on Russia. The various measures we've taken to excise Russia from the global economy. And regardless of your view of that conflict, I think it's a good thing that we had the capacity to do that if we decided it was best. We don't have the capacity to do that with China, even if we did decide it was best. And that represents to me a major compromise of American political and economic sovereignty. And if we admit, as I think you rightly have, that efficiency is not the only measure we should be looking at, that allows us to consider other measures, like our ability to act freely in our own interests on the global stage. A more resilient supply chain structure would let us do that if we decided we need to. So that's just maybe one example. There are a lot of other conversations we could have in that vein, but that's my view.
And with the right leadership, we can achieve that.
I think so.
Yeah, okay, good. Mr. Slaughter, I've got about a minute left. Can you differentiate between general blockchain technology and cryptocurrency?
Sure. So in many ways, they are connected. It depends upon the nature of the blockchain. In a permissionless blockchain, which everyone is accessible to, such as Ethereum, you need a crypto token to create the functioning of the blockchain, the proof of consensus. There are permission blockchains or very private blockchains that don't utilize that, but then you lose the decentralization. To have the full decentralization, which is most useful for things that have many different companies engaged together and sharing information, that's where a token is useful.
Okay, and Mr. Griswold, obviously we're on this emerging technology. We're dependent on critical materials. China dominates that. 60% of worldwide production and 85% of processing capacity of these rare materials. What are the risks to national security that this might pose?
The risks are profound, and I know I've offered a lot of criticism of the Biden administration's supply chain review exercise, so let me offer a positive word. The Department of Defense's supply chain resiliency review is very clear and explicit about these dangers.
Okay, good.
That it is a clear and present national security threat to the United States and to many of our allies that we cannot produce the things we need domestically. Or source the inputs that we need domestically.
Okay, I've got another follow-up question for you, but I don't have time. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman, but please get back with us on the answer to that last question. Mr. Griswold, thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and now I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to thank Chairman Bilirakis and Ranking Member Schakowsky for holding this hearing, and thank you all for being here. I think I'm the last one, so you're almost done. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 5146, the Advancing the Gig Economy Act, which I co-led with Congressman Joyce. This bill seeks to uncover barriers to businesses conducting interstate trade by studying the impact of the independent workforce on our economy. Over the past few years, Hoosiers in southern Indiana have felt the ripples in our economy caused by shortages of semiconductor chips, critical manufacturing equipment, everyday consumer products, and of course, inflation. We learned the hard way that our economy cannot rely solely on adversarial nations to secure our supply chains, and I did have a sponsor, I did get a bill passed in July that would favor friendly nations and prioritize our friends. And we learned from years of dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic, the difficult companies face in quelling workforce shortages. Auto manufacturers like Honda in Greensburg and the Indianapolis International Airport in my district told me firsthand the potential impacts on day-to-day operations because of workforce shortages. My greatest priority in Congress has been fighting for policies that have the opportunity to create good incomes for Hoosiers and all Americans. Ms. Ghazarian, you stated in your testimony that many startups and small businesses use 1099 employees to give them flexibility as they grow and develop their companies. In fact, survey after survey shows that independent work is popular and growing where access to benefits is less important to the individual. According to a study published by George Mason University, today 1 in 10 workers engage in independent work as a primary source of income, and as many as 1 in 3 use independent work as a supplementary income source. Ironically, my wife does antique malls where she's got about 800 gig economy people that are doing it for fun, and many of them do very well. So, ma'am, I ask you a question. How would a Department of Commerce study that looks at the whole picture of the independent workforce be beneficial for you to determine how to balance the flexibility and entrepreneurship that you prize, and how can it contribute to improving interstate commerce?
Great question, thank you. So if you could get a good understanding of the skill set and nature of the independent workforce that you could lean into and how you could leverage that within the needs of the business, and as the business changes from day to day, there would be those needs where you would look for certain individuals to help you build your business, depending on what that need is. Some days it might revolve around supply chain and the expertise you might need there. Other days it might lie around engineers and what you're doing to build products. If there was some sort of infrastructure or network that you could leverage into to learn about what those resources are and have access to it, I think would be very helpful for businesses like mine to be able to expand and then in turn shrink as needed when those resources are not needed anymore,
Right.
to stay nimble.
Right, okay, thank you. Mr. Griswold, a question for you. When contemplating the strategy of decoupling from certain foreign supply chains, how are we evaluating the infrastructure and workforce limitations, not only within the United States, but, and as you know, the China issue, but also in countries where we're considering as a potential alternative source? And I know that we've moved to some other companies, but how do we look at that?
It's an important question, and I would start actually by talking about our workforce development and education system in the United States. Fewer than 1 in 5 young Americans go smoothly from graduating from high school into a 4-year degree, into a job that required that degree, and yet the vast majority of our federal education spending is directed at college students. Mm-hmm. I think that's remarkably skewed, mm-hmm. and as a broad and important matter, we need to heavily invest in non-college pathways for the majority of Americans.
Yeah, we have some great programs in Indiana, and I think that's right. And a lot of those graduates are doing a lot better. With that, I yield back my time to the chairman. I'm sorry, to Congresswoman Miller Meeks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and also Chair Bilirakis for hosting this hearing. Manufacturing, as we know, has been hit hard by the global supply chain constraints over the last few years, with record high inflation and supply chain disruptions impacting numerous sectors of our economy. As global competition has increased, control over our supply chains has fallen into the hands of our foreign adversaries, namely the Chinese Communist Party. Such geographic concentration of supply chains has left many U.S. companies vulnerable to disruption. And it's essential now more than ever for the U.S. to strengthen our domestic supply chain resiliency, especially in infrastructure areas including critical manufacturing, U.S. defense industrial base, energy, food, and agriculture. That's why I'm pleased this legislative hearing includes my bill, the Critical Infrastructure Manufacturing Feasibility Act, which directs the Secretary of Commerce to conduct a study on the feasibility of manufacturing more critical infrastructure goods in the United States, in particular, manufacturing products which many are developed in rural communities such as in Iowa and in my district. Mr. Griswold, what steps need to be taken, and you may have answered this, to increase domestic manufacturing of critical infrastructure products? And secondly, what biggest impediments, and we've heard a bit about permitting, to enhancing these sectors, specifically in the renewable energy sectors and critical mineral processing?
If I can be forgiven for organizational self-promotion, we recently released a book of policy ideas titled Rebuilding American Capitalism, a handbook for conservative policymakers, which I would love to discuss with you in your office, that has a whole suite of policy ideas to address exactly what you're talking about. Both carrots and sticks are important. And again, that's a long conversation, but on the sticks side, I think tariffs and guardrails have their place. Domestic content requirements may have their place. Adequate financing for critical industries have their place. Helping pre-competitive research collaboration between innovative companies is an important step. There's a whole range of important policy conversations I think we should have on how to rebuild our domestic productive capacity.
And other than permitting, greatest impediments?
I think, to be frank, I think the greatest impediment is the outdated mindset that thankfully is, I think, changing in Washington, that market efficiency is the primary measure by which we should determine economic policy. And we had this discussion briefly with one of your colleagues. Clearly, national security, national economic resilience, the common good and the well-being of American working people and their ability to support their families are I think, considerations that have not always had their due in the last few decades of American policymaking and need to. To the extent to which that mindset changes, I think good policy follows.
I might add inertia to that list. So,
indeed, yes.
But, thank you so much, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Now I'll recognize the chairman who waved on to the subcommittee today, Mr. Johnson, who's a good friend of mine, and I also look forward to, I want to thank you for calling this hearing on Thursday in East Palestine. And I appreciate, thank you for your leadership. I think it was long overdue, and I appreciate you taking the initiative, and I look forward to participating.
Good deal.
So, all right, very good. I recognize you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you will certainly be welcomed with open arms there in East Palestine. Thank you. And thanks for letting me wave on today. I appreciate our witnesses being here for such an important topic when we're talking about America's supply chains. I'm very pleased that my legislation, H.R. 5398, the Advancing Tech Startups Act, was included in today's legislative hearing. The bipartisan legislation would require the Department of Commerce to study and report on the impact of technology startups on the U.S. economy. It also promotes a national strategy for encouraging more tech-focused startups and small businesses in all parts of the United States. You don't have to be in Silicon Valley to successfully launch a tech startup. I'm an entrepreneur myself. That's a different story. But the talent, sustainable cost structure, and opportunity are available in many locations across the country. Additionally, I'm proud to co-lead H.R. 5390 with my colleagues, Reps. Miller Meeks, who you just heard from, Bouchon, Custer, Schreier, and Spanberger. This bill requires the Department of Commerce to study and report on products that are in high demand across the critical infrastructure sectors. Importantly, the bill includes feasibility studies for manufacturing products representative of many rural counties in my district in eastern Ohio. I know that manufacturing in these communities can and should play an increased role in making products for critical infrastructure sectors and in our nation's supply chain. As we know, the pandemic painfully revealed the importance of creating products, supply chains, and intellectual capital right here at home. We can't rely on China or anyone else, and we don't need to. While we must ensure our supply chains are resilient in a global economy, we must also be self-sufficient in critical areas. It's time to fully unleash the American spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship across the entire United States. Mr. Slaughter, in your opinion, would a national strategy such as the one described by my legislation, the Advancing Tech Startups Act, that identifies barriers and encourages more tech-focused startups and small businesses in all parts of the United States, would that help to better prepare our economy for future disruptions to our manufacturing sector and supply chain?
I think it would. I think a lot of the appeal of crypto and blockchain in particular is you can do it from anywhere. Many of our portfolio companies at Paradigm are largely or fully remote. There's the possibility of having tech jobs throughout the entire country, including those looked over regions that have not benefited from Web 1 and Web 2.
Good. Did the pandemic impact the success of tech startups?
Inherently, I think it impacted all of us. Everyone had to respond differently to the effects of disruption and to the effects in the markets. But I think many of us came through it with a greater appreciation for how we can respond to additional disruption in the future as well.
Do you have any other recommendations for increasing the resiliency of our supply chains?
Such a good question. It's somewhat beyond my ken, but I would suggest the number one thing is to make sure that you don't involve supply chains becoming the province of a few companies that control the information.
Mm-hmm.
The worst thing would be to have a few more companies that, because they control the entire data stream, become black boxes and rent-seek on everybody else.
Yeah.
Better to have this throughout the entire economy so everyone can benefit.
Yeah, I agree. I personally believe that we should restrain from outsourcing anything in our supply chain below the minimum amount required to sustain our own culture here at home. We need to identify what those critical needs are and keep a focus on that. Ms. Ghazarian, you mentioned in your have I got that right? Did I say that right?
You got it right.
Thank you. You mentioned in your testimony that shifting supply chains is not costless and does not happen overnight. What advice do you have for other companies and particularly startups looking to center their supply chains through American companies and products?
Absolutely. I would say the first thing is you really need to do your homework in regards to the resources that you need to build your products and stay at the quality, safety, and efficiency level to make sure that if you are going to produce something here, you can do so safely. Then on top of that, are the costs effective to be able to stay competitive in the market with your competition that may still be producing elsewhere?
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, I've heard from many manufacturers that tell me the quality of the raw materials they get from countries like China, even though China is dumping excess capacity on the global market, trying to disenfranchise American workers, the quality of their raw materials. Sometimes companies have to order 3 and 4 times as much so that they can get just enough to meet their needs. Even though China holds the market on those raw materials, their quality simply is not there. We can beat them at this game if we're smart. Thank our panelists, and I yield back.
Agreed. Oh, I would just want to thank the panel for all your direct responses. I know I learned quite a bit during this hearing, and I appreciate it very much. And I appreciate the ranking member holding this hearing with me. And with that, we're going to close up here. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list without objection. So ordered. And again, we have additional questions. So if you could respond to those questions in writing, we'd appreciate it. I remind members again that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record and ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business day on October 4th. So again, I appreciate your testimony and your direct responses to the questions. Without objection, the committee is adjourned. Thank you.